Let's begin. Anand, when the referendum result came through in 2016, there was very little certainty about what Brexit would mean. I remember even reading some interviews with Leave voters at the time who thought that we'd just announced we were out and that would be it, job done. What shape did you expect Brexit to take back then?
I think back then, naively, I expected it to be far softer. In retrospect, I was being an idiot, because if you have a campaign that's run on the basis of control, then actually the one thing you can't do is be anywhere near the single market where borders, money and laws aren't fully in your control. So I think I was slightly naive then. And I, like everyone else, including her own cabinet, I think were utterly taken aback when Theresa May took to the stage in October at the Conservative Party conference and laid down those red lines.
Was that because, Boris Johnson had more or less said that we would stay in the single market, so you thought that was how it would play out?
To an extent, yes. I remember we had stuff on our website then being a little bit kind of, it's not quite that easy, because A, you've got to negotiate it, and B, which I still believe when you hear this debate about the single market, that includes some really nasty trade-offs. I mean, whether an economy as big and as complicated as ours, i.e. not the Norwegian economy, could put itself in that position. Could you imagine, EU regulations on financial services over which we have no vote, regulating the City of London? I think it would be a massive problem. So we thought it would have been problematic. I didn't have a clear shape in my head. We knew there would be issues around single market, but I think I naively thought we would come up with some sort of arrangement whereby trade wouldn't be as badly affected as it has been.
When Remainers were speculating and warning about Brexit before the vote, what did we fail to realise? And what did we just get wrong in retrospect?
Well, that's a big we, and I think...
Well, when I say we, I mean me, because I was on Remainiac, so I was clearly a big part of this, I don't mean you, I mean Remainers per se.
I mean, this isn't meant as a slight, but I don't blame you as much as I blame David Cameron.
Good.
Right.
That's a low fucking bar. That's also a relief. Because if you were more to blame, you wouldn't think of your roles back. I think of it.
I do wonder about my role in all of this sometimes, but I nonetheless, go on.
But I think what they got wrong, there's a list of what they got wrong. From the hubristic attitude of saying, once we've won this, we'll put the party back together again, which meant you couldn't attack other Tories. I remember during the campaign you remember that poster of Ed Miliband in Nicola Sturgeon's pocket that the Tories used in the 2015. They had one of those with Boris Johnson and Michael Gove in Nigel Farage's pocket that David Cameron vetoed the use of because it was blue on blue and was seen to be, it's a little bit rude to other Conservatives. So they fought with one hand tied behind their back, which was a massive mistake. David Cameron, having spent 5 years doing ridiculous stuff by every time before there was a European Council saying, I'd rather be anywhere than going to Brussels, coming out as pro-EU and saying our security depends on this organisation, was less than convincing. There's a long, long list of what the Conservatives did wrong at the head of the Remain campaign. The other thing I would say is one of the most bizarre spectacles during the referendum were Tory ministers essentially campaigning against austerity as part of the referendum campaign. That red bus for me wasn't just a Leave bus, it was an anti-austerity bus. It was about we're going to plough money back into public services, sotto voce, because we have screwed them over the last 6 years. And I think that whole austerity debate played into the Brexit thing quite fundamentally.
Yeah. But returning again to Remainers, we clearly made...
You were never self-obsessed, at least.
We clearly made huge mistakes. We failed to persuade. We didn't stop a very hard Brexit. Not the hardest that could possibly have been, but a hard Brexit. But how did we get it wrong in a way? Why did we fail to persuade?
At which part? We're still talking referendum or subsequently?
Subsequently, after the referendum, when it was all up for, not all up for grabs, but when there was very much uncertainty about what form Brexit would take.
Towards the end, I think there were two things. I think one, the slightly scorched earth policy that was essentially shared between the ERG and the Second Referendum Brigade, which basically meant our job is to basically sack off every other alternative apart from the extremes. I think that essentially killed the soft ground in between those two extremes. And the other thing, a lot of people say Brexit blurred party lines. It really didn't, because ultimately, even though Theresa May's Brexit deal, ticked every single one of the Corbynite boxes for Brexit. What Jeremy Corbyn demanded from Brexit, Theresa May had delivered. And it's worth noting that she negotiated a far better deal with the European Union than I think anyone familiar with the European Union thought they'd be willing to give. But ultimately, why did Labour vote against it? Not because of what it said, but because it was a Tory deal, because she negotiated it. So party politics reasserted itself right at the end, I think, which was absolutely fundamental to the story.
And looking at it now, 5 years on, we can really get a sense of what Brexit has done to the economy. What has Brexit done to the economy? How has it changed it?
Well, I mean, it's a work in progress. Okay, so it's only 4 years since we actually left the end of the transition period. It's had an impact on goods trade. That much is very clear now. It's particularly had an impact on the number of trading relationships between us and the European Union. The evidence is an awful lot of small firms have pulled out of that market now just because of the paperwork and the cost. There was a remarkable thing a couple of weeks ago, I don't know if you heard it, where the head of M&S said, we've rented warehouses to store the paperwork. So the surprising thing, I suppose, is that services trade has held up. Now, I would have thought services trade would have held up and been a bit better still were it not for Brexit, but the numbers on services trade belie the expectations. And the final area where there has been an impact, I think, has been in terms of investment. Investment stalled after 2016 and has never really recovered. And, in a week when we're talking about Rachel Reeves and growth, that lack of investment is absolutely fundamental to our appalling productivity story.
And you mentioned earlier on that maybe the COVID recovery fund, the EU's COVID recovery fund, wouldn't have gone through if we had still been a member. What else has Brexit damaged? Is the EU weaker because we left?
Absolutely. They're smaller. They have less in the way of foreign and defence policy resources. There's no way around the fact that the European Union is weaker without us. It's different ideologically without us. But actually is able to do some things, some integrative things now that wouldn't have been possible if we'd been there.
The last question specifically for you here, I suppose, is just what is the override? Is there an overriding explanation for the Leave vote? Because I remember reading so many different explanations for why people voted Leave. Do we finally have an idea of whether there was one big one, or was it always an assortment of desires and grievances that were all in some way pinned to the Leave vote?
I mean, there were always more people in this country dissatisfied with membership than was the case in other member states. But you layer that onto an incredibly unpopular government, an economy that had essentially flatlined since 2008, or even before. I mean, even before 2008, Gordon Brown was sort of having summits in number 11 about how to have productivity growth. And on top of that, the real unpopularity of the political class. I mean, one of the really fascinating things about our politics is the last election, 2024, was a throwback to 2015. And in 2015, we had then the lowest ever share of the vote gained by the two big parties. It was surpassed this last year. And that real sense of disillusionment with mainstream politics. And I think that fed into it. That was the starting gun, if you like, of the period of the last 10 years in the Western world as a whole of anti-incumbency, anti-politics fueling populism and other sort of anti-system forces.
Marie, have you in any way made your peace with Brexit?
It's actually been a slightly weird journey because I think I made my peace with it a long time ago and I've now maybe unmade my peace. Because obviously, I was covering Brexit. I started working in Westminster in 2015, so I was very much there. All the votes. I watched several of the Theresa May votes in Parliament, in the bar, obviously. But I think in that context, because professionally I had to talk to everyone all the time, it felt easier to just kind of set my own feelings aside. And also I think it became quite clear to me quite quickly that there was obviously never going to be a second referendum. We were obviously going to leave anyway. So I think I definitely had lots of frustrations along the way about, against sort of people who, again, either because I guess that was Remainiacs, but the people who very much like second referendum or nothing. I was very frustrated with the kind of, very hard Brexit or nothing people. But I did have some sympathy for the kind of soft leavers. And again, thought the May deal was pretty good. And I'm slightly biased because I do know a civil servant who worked on it. So I feel like, I was forced to learn about it to be a good friend. No, not to be a good journalist, Jesus, And yeah, so I think I spent quite a while going, okay, well, fine, this is just something that's clearly going to have to happen, and it's annoying, but it's fine. But no, so I think I can't remember exactly when. I think it might have been about 2 years ago. I think so. My little brother, his girlfriend, and their group of their friends, are all French living in Paris, came to London for a weekend. So I took them out for brunch, and there's about sort of like 7-8 of them in their mid-20s. All spoke reasonably good English, all university educated, interesting sort of young people. And yet none of them had ever lived in London. None of them had ever considered moving to London, and none of them had any had ever any sort of interest in moving, even though they liked it as a holiday destination. And I was like, and I had this really shocking moment where I thought, but if you compare that to my cohort of, my friends, so like, a few years younger than that, obviously I live here and I've stayed here, but also so many of my friends moved here for a few years, so went to university in Britain and then actually went back to France, or stayed and worked for a few years, then moved elsewhere. Like, so many of my friends spent at least a few years in Britain, and they're kind of in their late teenagers and in their 20s. And I had such a big, Jesus fucking Christ, this is what we had, and I had such a deep, tangible sense of we've actually lost something that was really special. And I know that's, obviously a very personal, quite small level, I guess, but I was like, but I feel like Britain is presumably a lot less rich kind of culturally, because of that. All these kids, are going to have slightly less interesting lives, because I feel like London was just so obviously the place you'd go to. And from that point onwards, I think that's when I allowed myself to kind of emotionally process Brexit. And I was it is a fucking waste. And I think I do resent as well. Sorry, I feel like I'm on a rant now.
I can cut you off if you like.
But just on the last point, I think I also really resented, for quite a long time, the idea that if you said in any way that maybe Brexit wasn't going terribly well, then you were some kind of national traitor, Remainer, bollocks, whatever. When it's fine, it's an opinion that's fine to have. You can just say there was a referendum, we left, fine, but also that sucks. And I feel like we can say that about any other political decision. So I think eventually I reached boiling point where I was like, well, why can't we say that about Brexit though? And still be taken seriously.
Yeah, and I guess I'm thinking of something that I think was John Curtis said last night at your launch event. And when he was pointing out the immigration had gone up a lot since Brexit, and that wasn't what people had expected to be voting for. But also, of course, the kind of immigrants have changed, and it's no longer, as you say, Marie, European so much, but people from, in particular, Nigeria, India, especially, who are coming here to do those jobs. And I suppose I'm wondering if, when we think about the effect it's had, whether, in a way, as John Curtis himself quite provocatively suggested to I think the Remainers there, we should welcome this opportunity that it opened up for many more, a much wider group of people ethnically to come to Britain and to have their time here in a way that you were able to do.
I mean, I personally find it hard to imagine how you could describe a situation where you've replaced the French with the Indians as anything other than a triumph, quite honestly.
I think the saddest thing about Marie's anecdote, though, is that the long tail of those small personal decisions that people from Europe were making in their late teens, early 20s about studying and so on, you see it echoed in the ending of the Erasmus scheme, is that our soft relationship with the entire European population is destroyed because we don't have this kind of kind feeling, this sort of warm feeling that harks people back to some months they spent in London or Bristol when they were 23. These things actually do really matter, because when those people are 45 and decision makers in businesses, they actually affect economic decision making. And so we lie to ourselves if we think the only decisions people make in business are hard financial ones. They make emotional decisions too, and that relationship's been lost.
And a lot of the abiding bitterness about Brexit, and many of our listeners will still feel it, is that it was a result obtained through lies and evasion. And yet the main parties have all made their peace with it. What would you say to the many people who still find it hard to accept that we pursued one of the hardest possible versions of something that has damaged us?
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, it was a fluke of political geography as much as anything else, wasn't it? Because I think I'm right in saying that in 2017 and in 2019, more people voted for Remain backing parties than voted for Leave backing parties. It was just very inefficiently done. So, in a sense, it was once the referendum had happened and once Theresa May had laid out her red lines, it was very, very difficult to do anything about it because we were then in the hands of a parliament that changed its composition in 2017, that was dominated by the intransigence of the sort of hard Brexit lot. I mean, I do think one of the problems with the sort of, if you could call it the liberal or the soft side of the Brexit debate, is they were just too damn polite. You know, your David Lidington's, David Gauke just wouldn't play dirty. They wouldn't threaten to bring the house down. And that played into the hands of the ERG. But it was very hard from outside Parliament to affect that, I think, at all.
I do think a problem with this as well, kind of looking at internal Tory politics, which I think we're still seeing play out now, and we saw during the leadership contest, etc., is that, and it took me a while to kind of cotton onto it, but I think centrist Tories, like what we think of as centrist Tories, will never quite seek to move the Overton window themselves. They'll always try to be like, okay, well, wherever the Tory party is now, we'll probably be on the left of that or the centre of that, but they never try to change it, whereas I think the right shifts the window. The centre and the left of the Conservative Parliamentary Party is like, oh, so Rwanda, for example, a lot of them, instead of going, no, we just, that's a mental idea, they were like, oh, well, we'll be softly against. Because that, and so I think that's a lot of what happened to Brexit as well. Like, they never sought to define the parameters of the debate. They always thought to be like, oh, well, we'll be on the kind of nicer side. And I think that's why the party keeps being dragged to the right again and again.
I mean, it's worth saying that, of course, you have the unique circumstance of Jeremy Corbyn. And I think for a lot of those people, whatever happened with Brexit, it could not be as bad as opening the door of number 10 to Jeremy Corbyn. So I think that conspired to make those choices a little bit harder for them.
Are there any upsides to Brexit?
Apart from the Indians.
Apart from the Indians.
I think one of the things that came out of Brexit that could be a positive is how our politics has changed. Our political debate has changed. We noticed inequality on the 24th of June 2016. We should have noticed it a long time before, but we didn't. The rewriting of the political geography of the UK has been really interesting. The fact that we have virtually no safe seats left, I think, has to be a good thing. The fact that politicians can't take voters for granted anymore is a good thing. I mean, obviously, all of this rests on the assumption that at a certain point in time, our politicians will act on the basis of this. But I think quite a lot of the shifts we've seen in politics are potentially beneficial, though the jury's very much still out as to what actually happens.
But also politics is a lot nastier, isn't it? And a lot coarser? Or am I just remembering things pre-2015?
I first started getting interested in politics during the miners' strike, and I grew up in West Yorkshire, and God, politics was pretty bloody nasty then.
Well, that's fair. But I suppose, as Marie was saying, the Overton window on many things has just changed, and partly as a result of Brexit and the constant push towards more extreme version of it. That doesn't seem like a good development in politics.
No, but I'd also say that the fact that it's happening in every other Western democracy points to the fact that it probably wasn't just Brexit that did that, and it might have happened anyway.
You mentioned that that poverty has been noticed, and it was clearly a factor in the decision. But then what's happened with that knowledge is not very much. So in the 10 years, we mentioned growth has been at its lowest, and that there's this awful plummet in British growth. But that isn't necessarily just to do with lack of investment because of Brexit. It's also because of the decisions of the Conservative Party over that period. So it's interesting that they took this knowledge from it and then we've done nothing with it as a political
that's
system.
absolutely true. I mean, what I would say is we have a Conservative Party now where Theresa May talks about the just about managings, where Boris Johnson talks about levelling up, where actually the issue of inequality got on the radar of the Conservative Party, which it wasn't beforehand, okay? Now, I'm not for a moment going to sit here and argue, and they acted to reduce it. They did nothing whatsoever. And you could sort of give them a bit of a get-out-of-jail-free card by saying they spent 3 years arguing about Brexit, then another 2 years trapped with COVID. So we were distracted by a load of other things, and no one has acted on it yet. And actually, talking about Rachel Reeves' growth agenda, I'd have liked a little bit more on the regional stuff because,
right.
Oxford, Cambridge is all well and good.
But what we heard.
Yeah, but it is there now, I think. And I think in that sense, Marie was talking about the Overton window. That Overton window has shifted. Regional inequality is part of the national debate. Now, it's up to politicians to run with that. But I think there is an opportunity to say we are going to do something about this because God knows our politics tells us that it really matters now in a way that there wasn't before. Now, you might say I'm sort of clutching straws here, but I do think that is important. And I do think it's refocused political attention a little bit. I'll tell you one story. The Centre for European Reform had its birthday party reception thing. And I can't remember who. I think it must have been when Starmer spoke to them, actually. But I was introduced to the new Japanese ambassador. So this was in 2022. whose first words to me were, "I'm absolutely fascinated by what's going to happen in Wakefield." Because the by-election was going to happen. Now, I grew up in Wakefield. Now, never in my wildest dreams I had ever heard anyone from outside Wakefield express the slightest bit of interest in Wakefield or even know where it was. And it did strike me then that actually, these previously safe Labour seats where people have put up with shit since the 80s were suddenly at the centre of political attention. And I thought that has to be a good thing. I mean, politics is yet to deliver on that, but it was a nice first step, I thought.
Yeah.
Hannah, has Brexit changed us as a country rather than just as a trading partner with Europe? Have we realised anything about ourselves that we didn't know before?
I think we sort of already knew that we were fractured as a population, that we had different sort of sects within us. But it gave us a language to talk about that, Brexit, which I think has actually been quite damaging. It's what's directly led to the rise of Farage reform, where we are now. The conversations that we had, the way Trumpism is becoming very popular among young people. And that has all been given a language through Brexit, which worries me. And it has become sort of the ultimate marker of social division. And I think from externally as a country, that makes us look a bit muddled outside. I think it's hard, people find it hard to know what Britain is, who British people are now, because we are still locked in this kind of internal war about what side we're on and what we really think of ourselves in the world. But it's only one thing I think that also it's taught us that we are better than politicians at admitting our mistakes, because if you look at the Statista data on whether or not it was the right thing to leave, that for much of the last 10 years we're kind of tracking the politics on that. There are politicians who believe it's right to leave, there are politicians who believe it's wrong, and there are in the population. But right now in 2024, which is when they last polled, we as a population, the majority now think it was wrong to leave, looking at the reality that we're in.
Yeah.
But politicians are not there. They haven't grappled with that, even though the people can see the truth.
But, can I just say one thing about that? It is certainly true that some people have changed their minds, but most of the shift in the opinion polling is down to what demographers politely call churn, which is,
That's a very good point.
It is a very different electorate now to the electorate in 2016 because of exits and entries into the electorate, if I can put it that way. But just going back to your point about what we've learned about ourselves, I think one of the really interesting things is we kind of figured out that the way we thought about the economy was wrong. Thinking simply about GDP was right. I remember during the referendum campaign, George Osborne made a couple of speeches, one in which he said, if we leave the European Union, the City of London will be damaged, and another in which he said, if we leave the European Union, house prices will come down. And a mate of mine from home, from Wakefield, rang me up and said, has he changed sides? Because those sound like really good outcomes to me. And the way it sort of toppled our assumptions about how people feel the economy, which is something that was very current during the US election, if you think about it.
Absolutely.
And I think we were slightly ahead of the curve there. We realised that actually the way the way economists talk about the economy is not necessarily the way people think about it. And it was impacting on people in all sorts of...
Although, interestingly enough, I'm no Corbynite, as people who have ever read anything I've written would know, but Corbyn got that right too.
Yep.
So that explains him.
Absolutely. Well, it's no coincidence that Farage the other week said there are similarities between myself and Jeremy Corbyn.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
And many of the Tories desperately wanted Brexit. And now their party is diminished, it's out of power, it's being rapidly eclipsed by reform in many ways. There's kind of something of the Greek tragedy about this, which I find quite fascinating. Was it Brexit alone that almost killed the Tory party? Or would they just have burnt themselves out anyway, like a battery that's overheated?
No, I don't think it was Brexit. I think the combination of their handling of COVID, including Partygate. It was Partygate and Liz. If you look at the polling, it's quite clear. Partygate and Liz Truss were the two turning points in terms of the popularity of the Conservative Party. And in a sense, that had nothing to do with Brexit. My hunch was always that Boris Johnson would win a second term before people started to see the contradictions inherent in what he was saying and the fact that it was very hard to deliver. The skill of Boris Johnson as a politician was he could go up to Yorkshire in the morning and promise investment and growth and come back to a sort of rubber chicken thing in Surrey in the evening and promise lower taxes, and no one would call him out on it. He could do that. And that's a real political skill. I thought that would come back to haunt him eventually, but I thought we'd have one more win in him.
But would Boris Johnson even have ever been Prime Minister without the push, exactly, that Brexit gave him? So without Brexit, no Boris Johnson, so no Liz Truss.
Well, I'm not convinced that 52-48 the other way in 2016 would have led to a stable political outcome.
No, I think you're probably right.
Is there an argument here that actually it's not Brexit that broke the Conservative Party, but Boris Johnson?
Yes.
Like, if you look at it the other way, of like, if Boris had not, I don't think if Boris hadn't come out for Brexit, or would David Cameron have been called the referendum in that way, etc. So I think, I think it's Boris Johnson that killed the 14 years of whatever that was.
Totally agree.
Right, let's wrap up that section with blaming Boris Johnson.
Woo!
Something we may have done in the past.